Sarah.
I put my hairbrush down on my vanity, noting with irritation how the fine flyaway wisps of my blonde hair are already starting to separate from the mass and rise into the dry fall evening air. Tonight, I could not care less. Tonight, the last thing on my mind is my hair. I smile at myself in the mirror, sharing a secret with my reflection. Our world will never be the same after tonight. As I pick up my handbag from the table and throw my wrap over my shoulders, I think for a moment that I feel Callum's touch on my shoulders. Though I know this is impossible, I let myself think for a moment that maybe his ghost is here tonight. Maybe his ghost knows my secret, feels my happiness, and is passing on a benediction of sorts. I whisper to the shadows where the lamplight doesn't quite reach, "Callum, is that you?" I expect no response, and I am not disappointed. I am distracted from listening to echoes of the dead by the arrival of my very much alive husband. Erik enters the room and holds out his arm to me. He asks,
"Did I hear you speaking to someone, my love?"
I smile at him and say, "Only to a memory." He smiles back, and we sweep down the hallway to the top of the stairs, at the foot of which awaits our carriage. I cast a surreptitious smile at the third bedroom as we pass it. As we ride out to Erik's new casino, I cast my mind back over the extraordinary series of events that led to me getting to know him. I first heard of him, though I didn't know it was him, on the ship that Callum and I had boarded to get to the New World. That voyage was so disorienting for so many reasons. Firstly, Callum and I hadn't even planned on sailing until approximately 48 hours before departure. But a friend of ours came to us in desperate need. Kirsty's mother had begun to ail badly, and Kirsty and her husband could not bring themselves to leave when the end was so near for their kinswoman. And they gave us the tickets at a discount. Callum and I had toyed with the idea of starting our new life in America, but had never expected the opportunity to present itself so quickly. The question of our new life made for another irregularity. We had nearly completed the standard waiting period of having the banns, our formal marriage announcement, read in the church. The custom was to make sure everyone knew, and so that anyone who had an objection could make it known. One more week and we'd be free to marry. But our boat had left before then. The priest had been most accommodating and wrote a letter that we could give to an American priest, stating that the formalities had been completed here in Ireland and we should be allowed to marry upon our arrival in America. We packed our trunks, throwing things into them at random and then trying to close the lids. Callum's were full of his books and writing implements, for he was a scholar. Mine were filled with cooking tools and some of the rare ingredients for my sweets. I had been running a small shop out of our house that sold my homemade sweets, but in our cash-poor village it was barely staying afloat. I was sure that there would be an opportunity to sell them in the New World. People with a sweet tooth existed everywhere, I reminded myself. Inspired, I quickly whipped up a batch of lollipops with the intention of selling them on board the ship. We hastily arranged for my brother to take the rest of our things and arranged the sale of our little house. Not that anyone was buying houses. Tossed our trunks in the wagon and rushed to catch the train to Belfast. We barely made it onto the ship before the anchors were pulled up and the engines rumbled, moving us away from the dock. Callum and I left our trunks in our small stateroom and ran up to the deck to wave at Ireland with the rest of the passengers. Though we knew none of the people who stood waving the ship off from the dock, it still felt like the only appropriate way to open such a voyage that would change our life. For the better, we hoped, although it remained to be seen. Callum and I returned below decks to our cabin, walking slowly, arm in arm. We talked of trivial things, each of us trying not to be the one to ask the question, what have we just done? We got to the cabin and turned to look at one another. Though Callum's gentle presence didn't always fill me with confidence, he saw then that I was desperately in need of reassurance. He explained to me calmly all the reasons why we had thought this move was a good idea. I felt myself relax as my panic receded. I threw my arms around him and held him tight, thankful for his presence. He held himself with a little tension.
Sarah, mon cuishle, I'm glad I can make you feel better. Now, we need to sort out some practicalities for the next few days. We have but a single bunk in this cabin.
Startled, I looked around, realizing that he was right. Our friend had purchased the cabin for herself and her husband. I didn't want to lie snoring in the relative comfort of the bunk while Callum made himself as comfortable as he could on the floor. Besides, the bunk was designed to hold passengers tightly inside it in rough seas, whereas the floor offered no such protection. I considered for a moment. Callum, we're but a week from being wed. Is it so wrong that we share the bunk? Who would know besides ourselves? He hesitated, but when I pointed out the discomfort and insecurity of the floor, he agreed with a trace of amusement. Glad to have that sorted out, I pulled my packet of lollipops from my trunk and set out to see if I could find some customers. I had to do anything to get away from the cabin. I could feel my face flaming red at the very thought of what I had proposed. I felt it to be the most fair option, but it still went against my upbringing. I wandered the decks, greeting anyone who looked like they spoke Gaelic or English, the two languages I know. I sold a handful of my lollipops to some eager youngsters and quickly gained the title Lolly Lady from them. I laughed at them and sent them on their way, cheeks bulging and sticks protruding from their lips. I strolled along the deck and came across two ladies dressed in French fashions. They were practicing their English, it seemed, for I could barely understand them through their atrocious French accents. I drew near to listen to them speak.
They've still not found the opera ghost.
Vraiment? I mean, really? I thought they had searched the opera from top to bottom.
So the paper said. The woman was found, rescued by her fiancé.
How romantic! What a chevalier he must be.
On the night everything happened, they thought they had found the man. There was a corpse found wearing a mask like the opera ghosts, but when they took it off, the man's face was normal. The man with the twisted face, the man who abducted his singing pupil, has never yet been found.
I wonder what that poor woman had to go through. You don't think she's... Here she dropped to a whisper. Enceinte? Expecting?
Well, this only happened 2 weeks ago, mind you. I expect another few weeks' wait will prove what actually happened to her. I can't even imagine having that happen to me, and from someone looking like this.
She held up the paper she had been reading the details from. A sketch that filled half the page showed a sinister-looking man in a mask that covered the right side of his face. A second sketch showed what the man's face was believed to look like without his mask. It was truly terrible to see. I felt a stab of pity for the man in the sketch. His life could not be easy, especially not now that he was hunted by law enforcement. The women noticed me listening then. I proffered my lollipops as my excuse for hovering over them, but they politely declined, got up and moved away down the deck. They left the paper fluttering in the breeze on the bench they had been seated on. I grabbed it before the sea breeze could take it. I wanted to read the details for myself and study the sketch some more. I retreated with it to our cabin, and flopped down on the bunk to read it. Before I knew it, Callum was standing over me, reminding me that it was time to dress for dinner. He glanced at the paper as I changed my outfit, but didn't seem to find it very interesting. We went to dinner. I almost managed to forget that this man would be sharing my bed tonight as we dined and made small talk. The fact of our imminent bed sharing came roaring back to me the instant we stepped back into our cabin after dinner. I sat in the bunk, and he got in next to me, still fully clothed. He'd picked up a book from his trunk, and we sat there companionably for another hour or so, getting used to each other's presence as his mellow voice poured the story into the air around us. Eventually, he placed a small slip of paper in the book as a bookmark and closed it. He put the book away before looking back at me. I could see from his wide eyes that he was feeling nervous too. I followed him out of the bunk and reached into my own trunk for my nightwear. I turned my back to him, too nervous to have him see me undress. But he mistook my meaning and came up behind me to undo the buttons down my back and loosen the laces of my corset. I stiffened at his unexpected touch, then relaxed a little as I realized he only intended to help. He spoke in a low voice as he worked.
Sarah, you need to know that I'll not touch you if you're not ready. Not now before our marriage, or even after it. I want for you to be open to me when I come to you.
I relaxed the rest of the way as I realized it was up to me whether we would celebrate our wedding night early or wait until it was official. I knew Callum could be relied on to keep his word. I crawled back into the bunk and he followed me in. He turned to me and lifted his hand and I tensed once more, but he only caressed my jaw and gave me a tender kiss. It was no more than we'd already done a number of times, but the fact that we were doing it while lying beside each other in our nightwear was what set my heart pounding. Suddenly curious, I kissed him back, caressing his jaw as he'd done to me. He smiled and turned to blow out the oil lamp so we could sleep. I stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. "Wait," I said. "Leave it lit. I want to see you." He froze for an instant, then obliged me by taking off his nightshirt. I had seen men without their shirts before, of course, but as my gaze travelled below his waist, I could feel my cheeks growing hot. He explained what it was that I was looking at, and I felt myself become interested despite my embarrassment. He began to pull the blanket up over himself and made to blow out the lamp once more. I let him, and I lay beside him in the pitch blackness of the cabin. He turned to me and laid his arm gently over my waist under the blanket. I heard a gentle snore coming from him and realized he was fast asleep. I, too, relaxed into sleep, worn out by the emotions of the day. The remaining 5 days of our voyage passed in a similar fashion. We would spend time inside and outside the cabin, separate or together. I sold out my stock of lollipops by the second day. He spent time in the gentleman's lounge, reading all kinds of things that had been provided in there. He brought me several more newspapers that reported the story of the opera ghost in Paris, knowing that I was interested in the story. We dined together in the dining room at mealtime, and then we retired to our bed, together, yet apart, as I still hadn't made up my mind that I was ready for him. I was just able to bear the weight of his arm over my belly as I slept without having a panic attack. We had changed our lives so suddenly and so drastically that I did not think I could endure another physical change in myself. Soon enough, the cry came that signaled our arrival in America. We filled out the appropriate paperwork for customs and were admitted into the country. We spent the first night in a hotel. A month passed. We got ourselves into a rented flat, found employment for us both, and figured out how to find our way around the city. The only thorn in our sides was that the priest we had approached refused to marry us straight away, saying the banns would need to be redone in America. I tried to argue that neither of us knew anyone here, so there was no one to object, but he insisted on following his protocol. We reluctantly agreed, although we decided by unspoken mutual consent, not to mention that we were living in a single residence in our technically unwed state. The priest's insistence on restarting the marriage process gave me an excuse to sleep apart from Callum, although I was still not sure why I needed such an excuse. Finally, one night, I steeled myself and went to his bed. I told him, "Callum, I am still fearful, but I don't want to wait any longer to start our lives together. I think I'm ready. But just promise me you'll be gentle." I looked at him pleadingly. He reached for me and I forced myself to move forward into his arms. The pain was less than I expected, and soon I began to feel the promised pleasure from his movements. I sighed as he separated himself from me, feeling the tension leave my limbs. He flopped down beside me, breathing hard. When he recovered, he asked me how I had found it. My only response was to give him a big kiss and exclaim, "I can't believe I waited so long." I woke up one morning, some 5 weeks after our first night together, entangled in his arms as had become usual for me. But something was wrong. Heat was pouring from his body, even though he had kicked the blankets off us both at some point in the night. His face glistened with sweat, and he seemed to be having a bad dream. When I shook him, his eyes opened the barest bit before the light struck his pupils, causing him to cry out an uncharacteristic curse and throw his arm over his eyes. I jumped out of bed to draw the curtains and darken the room as much as possible. His weakened voice came to me from the bed.
"You must stay away from me, Sarah. I don't know what this is or how contagious it is, but I'll not have you catching it. It feels like my whole body is on fire. Thank you for darkening the room. I'll trouble you perhaps for a glass of water, then I'll ask you to stay in the other room until I'm better."
He was so calm and confident that he would manage to beat this disease that it did not even occur to me to send for a doctor until it was too late. By the time the man arrived with his medical bag, Callum had slipped too far down the slope that led to his death. The doctor was only able to make him marginally more comfortable as we waited for the inevitable. I sat beside what would have been our marital bed, holding the hand of the man who would have been my husband. He tried again to banish me from the room in fear of contagion, but I ignored him. I had kept myself from this man for far too long, and I would not do so now when I could bring him comfort. We talked as long as his strength permitted, and then I sat watching him sleep. Our last conversation before his death was about what we had wanted from this marriage. It turned out both of us had wanted children, although we had never spoken of it to each other. As I reviewed all my new knowledge about married life, I realized that it was possible that I would have a child for him. I asked him if he thought it was possible and saw him close his eyes in emotion. It was only then that I realized how much he really wanted me to be already with child. But both of us knew the chances were not good. "Hey, no, listen to me, Callum. I am certain that I am with child, and I don't care that we are only together 5 weeks. God would not be so cruel as to take my husband from me without leaving something behind." I saw his brow crease and his lips move in fervent prayer, but no sound came from him. He slipped off to sleep, and I kept my vigil at his side. I woke to a cold feeling of dread. The lamp in the room had gone out, and I had apparently fallen asleep sitting up, holding his hand. I rubbed the hand as I stretched myself, trying not to make it obvious that I had failed to stay awake. The hand was oddly cold and stiff. Horror came over me. How I lit the lamp, shaking as I was, I shall never know, but when I got it lit, I could see that my vigil was no longer needed. Callum was gone. I stood over him, tears pouring down my face, trying to understand the fact that I was now alone in the world. I gave his cold lips one last kiss. Then I stood back up and made a vow that I would never again allow myself to be scared of anything. I had delayed and delayed giving myself to this man out of my fear, and I'd only had 5 weeks of loving him before he'd been ripped from me. I was alone in the world now. I dealt with the funeral details numbly. Some neighbours came to the visitation, but that was all. He is buried in the churchyard at St. Bride's. I tried to secure another plot for myself to lie beside him when my day shall come, but was told since we were not married I could not be guaranteed a plot, and if I got one, it would not be beside Callum. Disgusted, I never again darkened the church's door, although I still go to the churchyard regularly to leave flowers on his grave. I threw myself into my business. I established a successful shop that sold my sweets. My success brought all manner of male admirers, men eager to share or steal my good fortune. But I declined them all. I had buried my heart, and these men were wasting their time. 3 years passed. I began to wonder if my little operation could expand beyond its current location. An outing with an acquaintance one day to a carnival out of town inspired me to begin asking carnival owners if they would like me to sell my sweets inside their grounds to their customers. Several of them already had confectioners on site and declined my offer. Another couple of carnivals were filthy, dingy places where I could not bring myself to set foot, let alone spend my workday. I entered the Carling family carnival one day and looked around. The place felt clean and bright, with all the employees smiling and bustling about. I requested an interview with the manager and was shown into his little office caravan. He introduced himself as Erik and apologized for the disarray in the office. Apparently, he had only just come into control of the entire enterprise. He seemed terribly distracted by the press of business, so I made my pitch and kept it brief. I'd brought a sample lollipop to help my case, and when he put it in his mouth, the expression of joy and wonder at the flavor, butterscotch, warmed my heart. As I talked, I stared, as surreptitiously as I could, at the white mask that covered half of his face. The rest of his face was very handsome, and I suddenly wondered what it would feel like under my fingers. I flushed red and put this thought away. I had vowed not to be scared anymore, and I longed to test this vow out by asking the man out for dinner. But I needed to find out first if he was already attached to someone. I had a horror of being a homewrecker. He wrote up a contract for my confectionery services on the spot, and I thanked him, promising to return the next day to set up my new stall. I anticipated remarkable profits from crowds that were already in the mindset of maximizing the pleasure of their day. It was a situation tailor-made to sell sweets. The next day he stopped by my stall to greet me as I was setting up. I was distracted, setting things in order, but finally I paused to look at him. He lost the thread of the conversation as our eyes met. I could see his eyes looking out through his mask, and they spoke eloquently to me of a man trapped behind a face that drove most people away. I realized this was another perfect opportunity for me to be fearless. Surely nothing that mask might conceal could be that off-putting, balanced against the idea of getting to know the intriguing soul behind the mask. He stammered an awkward goodbye and almost ran away from me. I watched him go, but he didn't turn around. One of the carnival dancers stood across the aisle from my stall and glared at me with undisguised hatred. I wondered if I'd crossed some line and unknowingly attracted the attention of someone else's man, but the way he'd walked past her without even acknowledging her told me I was safe. It wasn't until some time after the day I'd taken the plunge and kissed him that I realized how our paths had crossed before. I was tidying the shelves in my apartment that were crammed full of all Column's old books when I stumbled across the pages I'd held on to, the newspapers from which I'd pieced together the tale of the opera ghost. The details of the man described in the story and the fact that Erik's past linked up so precisely with the tale told me it must have been he who was the culprit behind the entire scandal. I wondered how the caring, kind man I knew was capable of doing the dastardly acts that the newspapers had described with such excitement. I realized as I read the pages that I could only do one thing to help him move forward, away from this stain on his past. He was currently involved in the same type of scandalous relationship with me that he had been in Paris with this Christine. I had to change the relationship between us somehow, so that he would no longer be in such a morally grey area. The only way I could think of would be to nullify my contract with his carnival and hope he was interested enough in me to keep seeing me outside of our shared workplace. In keeping with my new philosophy of fearlessness, I marched into his office and laid my resignation on his assistant's desk, praying everything in our relationship would turn out as I envisioned. It turned out well, in that Erik immediately came to find me, and we ended up having a doubt about his past involvement with the opera singer and scheduling a date for that very evening. I also told him of my time with Colum and was relieved to hear Erik say that it did not matter to him. The night did not turn out well in that we were attacked by a group of men on that date. I still don't know where I found the strength to help Erik incapacitate them all and make our getaway. My strength and fearlessness all left me as he drove his carriage back to my apartment, and I bawled like a child, clutching Erik's hand. He cared for me in my distresses tenderly as a parent, and I wondered again how this could be the same man described in those old newspapers. He had literally confirmed to me that he was this vicious opera ghost, and I still couldn't believe it. He tucked me into my bed and made to leave, but I insisted he stay. I knew I would not sleep if he was not there. As it turned out, he refused to do anything that would make me feel insecure, and I slept like the dead that night. When I awoke, he was already up, watching me. The love I saw in his gaze reminded me very much of the adoration I'd seen in Callum's gaze when he'd asked me to marry him, and I suddenly wondered how long it might take Erik to ask me the same question. It was 3 years ago tonight that I actually did marry him, and we joined together as one. Since then, we've had so much happen to us. We bought a marital home. Erik's entertainment empire has grown by leaps and bounds. I came up with the name for his carnival. That dancer, Meg, keeps staring at him or at me as if she's trying to make us fall out of love, but I swear I love him more every day. And now, this. I accept a bite of lobster off his fork, but then I take his hands in mine. I cannot prevent a huge grin from breaking out on my face when I tell my husband he will be a father. I watch him go to pieces in front of me at this long-awaited news, and I swell with pride. No child will ever have a better father than this loving, caring man who I married.